Not all Germans were Nazis, and not all Nazis were Germans. I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that during the Second World War, also Danish, Norwegian, Dutch, Flemish, and even French and Spanish volunteers fought for the Germans. But did you know that also Russians fought for Germany during the Second World War? In this formations episode, we are going to talk about Russia's Axis volunteers, the Russians that served in pro-German units, such as the Russian Liberation Army and many more. Stay tuned! It's good to have you back on the channel, and if you happen to be new on this channel, my name is Stefan, I'm a history teacher from the Netherlands and I'm hustling history for you. And if you like that, then please consider subscribing and do not forget to hit the notification bell so you will become part of the hustle. Let's start. Russians that fought for the Germans during the Second World War? Yep, around 600,000 Russians did so. And this might sound kinda strange, since Germany invaded the Soviet Union and waged a war of extermination against its people. The Germans, they were hell-bent on bringing down the Judeo-Bolshevik state, and the Russians were seen as racially inferior. So this raises two questions. First of all, why would Russians want to fight for the Germans? And second, why would the Germans let the Russians fight for them? Furthermore, we're going to discuss in what units these Russians fought. Two revolutions took place in Russia in 1917 that left Russia under Bolshevik rule. At the moment when the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd and soon in Moscow as well, the Russian Civil War started, where the Reds, the Bolsheviks, the Russian communists, fought against the Whites, and the Whites were the opponents of the Bolsheviks. In the early 1920s, this conflict was as good as over, and the Whites lost, and those who were captured by the Reds were often tortured, executed, or deported. But some of them, they got away. They play a role in the pro-German Russian volunteers during World War II. As for those that stayed behind, they now lived in the Soviet Union. After Lenin passed away, several years later, it was Stalin who consolidated his power. And he unleashed the collectivization campaigns in which farmers were forced to merge their farms together. Because of misplanning, mismanagement, and also natural causes, famine struck, which led to the death of millions. The Ukrainians were deliberately starved by the Soviet dictator. In the 1930s, the Great Purge kicked off, in which, because of the paranoia of Stalin, hundreds and thousands of people were arrested and deported or executed. Needless to say, many people saw Stalin as a ruthless leader, and some of them saw him as an oppressor. Then, it was June 1941. What Stalin refused to believe now happened. 3.6 million Germans and pro-Axis troops marched into the Soviet Union. Despite severe losses, the Axis powers captured much ground and a huge amount of Soviet POWs. However, no preparations were made to accommodate that many POWs. Between June and December 1941, the Red Army lost 2,663,000 killed in action and 3,350,000 taken prisoner. Most of the 3 million Soviet prisoners who fell into German hands in the 1941 campaign were simply left to starve to death behind barbed wire. Hitler had explicitly forbidden the use of Soviet labor and assistance while conquering the East. Nevertheless, the first auxiliary volunteers were mobilized. And this happened in secret though, since Hitler was firmly against it. See, what we see here is a discussion between the Nazi ideologists and the pragmatists. The Slavic people were seen as subhumans. However, as the Germans poured into the Soviet Union, captured more and more ground, they needed more men to guard these territories and clear them of partisan and resistance activities. And the war demanded more and more manpower. And manpower was available since millions of Soviet POWs were put into camps, so there was manpower there. The first volunteers were mostly drawn from non-Russian nationalities. Think of people from the Caucasus and Turkestan. Later, Ukrainians and Cossacks were also recruited. And eventually, Russians were also able to join. According to historian Richard Overy, 1 million Soviet POWs ended up fighting for the Germans, and several hundred thousand of them were Russian. As for the non-Russian volunteers, it can be understandable. They hoped for a better life under German rule. But why would Russians want to fight for the Germans? One reason to join the Germans was simply survival. Many of the Red Army POWs starved in their camps. So it was either death in the POW camp, send for forced labor to Germany, or take your chances and join the enemy. Furthermore, many Soviet citizens were against Stalin. I mentioned the other nationalities, but don't forget that Russians themselves also suffered because of the collectivization campaigns and the Great Purge. There is no doubt that some of those who found themselves under German control in the East did work with the invader. Some did so voluntarily, spurred on by a genuine loathing of Soviet communism. Some did so in the mistaken belief that the Germans had enlightened views on the restoration of private land ownership and capitalist enterprise. And then there were also the white émigrés that were willing to fight for the German cause. The white émigrés were the people who were with the whites during the Russian Civil War and had managed to escape the country. Not all were soldiers. Many intellectuals of various professions, former businessmen and landowners whose possessions had been confiscated by the Bolsheviks and whose lives were at stake, since they were seen as the enemy of the people by the Reds, and escaped the country and settled in Western Europe or the US. Some white émigrés, they left for China, and some of them eventually ended up joining the Japanese, but that's a story for another time. So the white émigrés, they saw the Bolsheviks as a threat that needed to be dealt with, and they saw this as an opportunity to liberate their country from Stalin's rule. The first Russian volunteers were called Hibis, which stands for Hilfswillige, auxiliary volunteers. These were recruited out of military and logistical necessity. POWs could serve as interpreter, wagon and lorry drivers, cooks, medical orderlies, messengers and ammunition carriers. In September 1941, Hitler reluctantly agreed to allow the recruiting of Soviet citizens as unarmed volunteers. They could make up to 15% of a division's strength, 2,500 men, in the rear areas. Soon, however, the number got up and Hibis served in combat units. For example, when the 6th Army defended the Stalingrad pocket after the Red Army had encircled them, consisted of 25% of Hibis. I read that by 1944, at least 600,000 Hibis served in the German army. Also, females served as medical officers and nurses. The German attitude towards the Hibis ranged from hostility, because they were seen as subhumans, but also admiration, because they were seen as people who put everything on the line by joining the Germans and had everything to lose once they crossed back to their own lines. Hibis also served in the Luftwaffe, and then there were also the Troniki men that served at the ghettos and the camps. From August 1941, the Germans also established the so-called security units, Sicherungsverbände. Apart from Russians, some Ukrainians and Belarusians also joined these security units, and their job was to patrol in the rear area and clear that of resistance activities. They fought against partisans and Red Army stragglers. At the same time, the SS also raised local militia to do this job. Now do note here that the security units had no standard organization and were mostly a hodgepodge of all kinds of different militia that were serving the Germans, mostly by patrolling the rear areas and fighting against the partisans. They were sometimes led by German officers, but also by Russian officers. One of them was Bronislav Kaminsky. He would later make a career within the branch of Russian volunteers for Germany. We talk more about him later.
Прошу господина генерала передать генералу Кэс, что мы, добровольцы русской освободительной армии, готовы нести нашу идею в массы, готовы на борьбу и в нужный момент с оружием в руках, готовы идти в бой на борьбу и уничтожение большевизма в союзе с немецким народом. За нерушимый союз, за победу над большевизмом. Ура!
Perhaps the most well-known pro-German Russian army formation was the Russian Liberation Army, also known as the Vlasov Brigade. It was initiated by General Lieutenant Andrey Vlasov. He was born in 1900 and in 1919 was drafted by the Red Army. He fought in severe conflicts during the Russian Civil War on Crimea, the Caucasus, and Ukraine. In 1930, he became a member of the Communist Party. He rose through the ranks and he survived the Stalinist purges. When the Germans invaded, he was stationed near Kiev and fought his way out of an encirclement. He later fought near Moscow, and in March 1942, he was stationed at the Volkhov front near Leningrad. There, his army got surrounded and slaughtered the subsequent summer. He was captured and sent to a special POW camp for prominent prisoners of war near Vinnytsia in Ukraine. There, he wrote a letter to the German authorities where he proposed the establishment of an anti-Bolshevik Russian army, the Russian Liberation Army. There are various reasons suggested for Vlasov's sudden conversion. His brother was shot in the Civil War for alleged anti-Bolshevik conspiracy. He had given his elderly parents a cow as a present and they were punished for it as rich peasants. He is reported to have been shocked by the sight of Ukrainians greeting the Germans with flowers, bread and salt, which awoke in him a realization of how unpopular Stalin was. The most likely explanation is the one Vlasov himself gave. He was alienated from a system that traded in lies and deceit, butchered its own people, and threw thousands of soldiers into battles for which they were poorly prepared. Hitler was against it, but many German officers and diplomats, they were sympathetic to Vlasov's idea. In December 1942, Vlasov issued the Smolensk Declaration, in which he made an appeal to the Soviet people. Friends and brothers, Bolshevism is the enemy of the Russian people. It has brought countless disasters to our country. Enough blood has been spilled. There has been enough starvation, forced labor, and suffering in the Bolshevik torture chambers. Arise and join the struggle for freedom. Long may peace with honor with Germany prevail. In the declaration, Vlasov argued against the state-run economy and the collective farms he wanted to abolish. Furthermore, he wanted to grant civil rights to the Russian people, modeled on German lines. Now, we know that if the Germans had succeeded in conquering the East, they would never grant anyone any civil rights. And Hitler, he remained immovably against the idea of a so-called Russian Liberation Army because he believed it might undermine his plans for the East. Nevertheless, the Russian Liberation Army was established. In February 1943, already existing Hibis and security units formations, they were transferred to the Russian Liberation Army. They not only consisted out of Russians, but also Ukrainians and Belarusians.
В последнее время ширится антибольшевистское движение среди русского народа. В части русской освободительной армии поступает масса заявлений с просьбой о зачислении в части РОА. На днях в одной из учебных частей РОА в присутствии почетного гостя от Верховного командования германской армии состоялся очередной выпуск курсантов. Перед отправлением в часть курсанты присягали на верность Родине.
Слушайте текст присяги. Я, верный сын моей Родины, вступая добровольно в ряды русской освободительной армии, торжественно клянусь честно бороться против большевиков за благо моей Родины. В этой борьбе против общего врага на стороне германской армии и ее союзников клянусь быть верным и беспрекословно повиноваться вождю и главнокомандующему всех освободительных армий Адольфу Гитлеру. Я готов во исполнении этой клятвы не щадить себя и свою жизнь.
Поздравляя с окончанием учебы, начальник курсов генерал РОА выразил в своем выступлении желание и волю русской освободительной армии. Он сказал:
The ROA was a series of independent battalions and companies under German command. Understand here that Vlasov himself wasn't the commander of this unit. He served as a figurehead to recruit POWs for the army. This would later change. After Stalingrad, the Axis armies retreated and desertions and mutinies among the 74 ROA battalions began to increase. In September 43, a number of 46 of these units were therefore transferred to France and northern Italy. Some were even stationed on the Channel Islands. During the D-Day landings, several of these battalions saw action and suffered losses. They would later fight in Belgium, while others were stationed in Denmark. A number of 20 battalions would fight on in the east until their destruction, and 8 battalions retreated with the Germans back into Belarus, Poland, and eventually Germany. Now, I mentioned that Vlasov had no control of the Russian Liberation Army. Now, this would change because in September 1944, Hitler approved the idea of the Russian Committee. By now, Germany was into the defense and pragmatism had taken the upper hand. Everybody that was able to carry a gun had to fight the enemy. In November 1944, Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler promoted Vlasov to full general and gave him control of 45,000 Russian Axis troops. Vlasov created the Russian People's Liberation Committee. This happened in German-occupied Prague, where he issued the Prague Manifesto, in which he advocated for a democratic Russia allied to Germany. Wow. Looking at the battlefield lines, this was ambitious to say the least. The armed forces of the KONR were named the VS KONR. Also, a 7,500 strong KONR Air Force was established. These forces saw action in the last months of the war at the Eastern Front. I read that some of them fought in Nuremberg against the Americans. The story of Vlasov and the Russian Liberation Army and the KONR has an interesting twist, because near the end of the war, he was in Prague when the Prague uprising occurred, where the Czech resistance rose against the German occupier, and Vlasov troops ended up at the side of the Czech resistance fighting at the Germans. After this, they moved west, hoping to fall into the hands of the Western Allies. How did it end up with them? You'll find out later. So let's take a look at other Russian units that fought for the Germans. Now, I mentioned that in the Russian Liberation Army, Vlasov himself wasn't in control, and it was most of the time German officers who ran the battalions. However, this was not the case with several other pro-Axis Russian units that fought for the Germans. They were sometimes commanded by Russian officers, although it was under German supervision. The Russian Nationalist People's Army, the RNNA, also known as Graukov, consisted out of anti-Bolshevik Russians, both from the Soviet Union and white émigrés. This unit had different names, among which SS-Verband Graukov during its short lifespan of less than a year. Established in March 1942, these Russians named themselves the Russian Nationalist People's Army, in short the RNNA, and by December 42 it consisted of 7,000 men. The unit was disbanded in February 1943 because of German suspicions as a result of a big desertion. The SS-Verband Drushina, also known as the 30th Waffen-Grenadier Division of the SS, in March 1942, the German Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, the intelligence agency of the SS, and the Nazi Party recruited Russian POWs into the battalion SS Unit Drushina. This was all done for Operation Zeppelin, where the Germans wanted to carry out missions behind Soviet lines. A few months later, this unit mostly conducted anti-partisan operations. There was Drushina 1 and a Drushina 2 regiment, which were combined in March 1943. Eventually, they would be absorbed in the ROA. Around 400 men switched sides and crossed to the Soviet lines to form an anti-fascist brigade, which was destroyed in battle in 1944. Perhaps the most notorious army formation that consisted of Russians that fought for the Germans was the SS-RONA, or Rhona, also known as the Kaminsky Brigade, which was led by Bronislav Kaminsky. We talked about him earlier. He was in charge of one of these security units. This unit was established by the Germans and consisted out of gangs of Soviet mercenaries and freebooters that patrolled in the rear areas and had to fight against the Soviet partisans. Its initial leader was Konstantin Voskobonikov. He virtually ran the area around Orel and Kursk for the Germans. With 20,000 men and 24 tanks, he terrorized the population, collecting taxes and food by force, murdering anyone who resisted. Soviet paratroopers dropped in the area assassinated him in January 1942. There were plenty of replacements. Voskobonikov was succeeded by the most notorious defector of all, Bronislav Kaminsky, another Soviet engineer who established a reign of terror and crime across the region, backed by 10,000 and thousands of camp followers. Kaminsky was left to pacify the region as he saw fit. His forces became part of the pretentiously titled Russian National Army of Liberation, though they liberated little, save other people's possessions. So the Russian National Liberation Army, in short RNA or Rhona, should not be confused with the Russian Liberation Army. This one was under direct control by Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler, and he directed the unit to Warsaw in the summer of 1944. There, the Poles had risen against the German occupier. The SS Rhona had to help in suppressing the uprising. Their behavior was appalling to say the least. They slaughtered thousands of Poles in the process that even left ordinary SS men bewildered. Their cruelty matched the cruelty of the notorious Dirlewanger Brigade. Because of their reckless and uncontrollable behavior, Kaminsky was shot on German orders. The remaining troops fought in Slovakia and eventually were placed under Vlasov's command. The first Russian National Army was originally known under different names such as Sunder Division R and was led by a Russian émigré named Count Boris Smyslovsky, who in December 1942 recruited 10,000 Red Army deserters and POWs into the Sunder Division R and was specialized in intelligence on partisans in the rear area. A year later, he was arrested for having links with the Polish Home Army and the UPA. By half a year later, he was declared innocent and released, and his division was reinstated in Breslau. Then there was also the Russian Protective Corps that was established in Serbia and consisted mostly out of white émigrés that had moved to Serbia in the early 1920s. It was based in German-occupied Serbia and would by September 1944 consist of 10,000 volunteers, part of them white émigrés, part of them also former Red Army POWs. Their main task was to guard the factories there, but eventually they ended up battling against the Yugoslav partisans, and later in 1944, when the Soviets marched onto Belgrade, they fought against them. Their uniforms were Yugoslav and they had Czechoslovak helmets, and later Wehrmacht uniforms were issued. Speaking of uniforms, when we talk about uniforms of the Russian volunteers for the Germans during the Second World War, there is a wide variety of uniforms and insignia. The Hibis at first had no own uniform, therefore many of them served in civilian clothing. Some Hibis that previously served in the Red Army were allowed to wear their Russian field shirt, the gimnastirka, albeit without Red Army insignia. On this photograph you see a photo of two Hibis from Latvia. The one on the right is wearing a Red Army shirt, and this person wears a Latvian Army uniform, the M1932, without insignia such as collar patches and shoulder straps. Both men have been awarded with the General Assault Badge for participating in 3 different attacks. So this already shows that the Hibis also did combat. From October 1941, the Hibis were provided with an armband which stated that they were serving the German army. After serving 2 months, German uniforms, insignia and ranks were allowed. As for the security units, they wore Red Army uniforms but also later prescribed German M1940 or captured uniforms. I've seen pictures of security units wearing Red Army field shirts together with the obsolete German M1916 helmet. And what about the uniforms of the Russian Liberation Army or the Vlasov Brigade? The ROA continued to wear German field grey uniforms, but new insignia reminiscent of pre-communist Russian uniforms were introduced. Officers initially wore a red oval painted metal cap badge with a surround of blue sun rays, but this was soon replaced by a red-blue oval with silver sun rays. Iconic were their Tsarist shoulder straps and their thong-shaped collar patches with a button on each end. Officers had these one in gold, by the way. From March 1944, Hiwi and ROA personnel adopted German collar patches. Furthermore, on the upper left sleeve they wore the ROA arm shield, which displayed the Cyrillic letters POA above the Russian St. Andrew's Cross, blue saltire on a red shield. Later, the VS KONR troops had the ROA shield on the right upper sleeve. Looking at the SS Rhona or Kaminsky Brigade, they wore the 1943 ROA uniforms with an arm shield with the letters POHA, Cyrillic form of Rhona, above a black St. George cross. Different variant forms existed. As for weaponry, they made use of German standard infantry weapons. Do note here that Hibis and security units fought with captured Soviet weaponry. Now, I presented you a broad overview, but do notice that there are many peculiar details and exceptions. And if you want to know more, I can recommend you this book. The details are in the description below under sources. So how did these Russian volunteers end up? Well, not well. As the Germans retreated, the Russian volunteers retreated with them. Now those who ended up in Red Army hands and eventually NKVD were mostly shot right away or tried and executed shortly after. Tens of thousands fought till the end of the war, and many of them retreated to the west in order to surrender to the Western Allies, not to fall into the hands of Stalin. However, little did they know was that the Allies had made a deal with Stalin during the Yalta Conference. Former Soviet citizens needed to be repatriated. Neither the British nor the Americans had fully thought through the implications of this agreement. Soviet authorities misled their allies by insisting that their citizens had been forced into German ranks against their will. They should be separated from German prisoners, treated well, and not categorized as prisoners of war. The British and Americans guessed that Stalin wanted revenge on all those Soviet citizens, around 1 million of them who served in Wehrmacht uniform or had been forced through starvation to become Hibis. Also, General Vlasov ended up in the hands of the Soviets. Refusing to vacant, he was tortured and eventually put on show trial and was executed by hanging in 1946. The forced repatriations were named Operation Keel, and this was a very tragic operation, also because of the fact that white émigrés were also repatriated. Think of this. These were people that had fled the country during or after the Russian Civil War and had basically never been Soviet citizens. Also, these were shipped off to the Soviet Union. None wished to return to the Soviet Union. None was technically required to be repatriated under the Yalta agreements. Yet, when the Soviet regime requested their return, hundreds were transferred by the British to the mercies of the Red forces from whom they had fled 25 years before. Not all were repatriated. I read that General Patton refused to comply. Also, the first Russian National Army, they made it to the little tiny state of Liechtenstein. And Liechtenstein had the courage to stand up against Soviets and basically refused to hand over its Russians. The most notorious case were the Cossacks. 50,000 of them were forcibly repatriated, among them 11,000 women, children, and elderly. But the story of the Cossacks during the Second World War is a story for another time. Because there are also the Cossacks that fought for the Germans, and apart from Russian, other nationalities from within the Soviet Union were also recruited by the Germans. Belarusians were drafted in the Belarusian Home Defense. Ukrainians fought in armies such as the Ukrainian Liberation Army, the Ukrainian National Army, the SS Volunteer Division Galicia, and the Nachtigall Battalion. Baltic people, Estonians, Latvians, fought in SS Legions, and then there were also the Eastern Legions, the Ostlegionen, that consisted of Caucasian volunteers such as Georgian, Armenian, Azerbaijani, and North Caucasian volunteers. We had Cossack and Kalmyk volunteers in the cavalry, and the Idel-Ural Legion, also known as the Volga-Tatar Legion, as well as Crimean volunteers. And then there were also the Central Asian volunteers that formed the Turkestan Legion. I think I have a lot of more work to do. So, subscribe to this channel so you do not miss out on future content. Thanks to my patrons, and a special thanks to Peter King, Cecile Collineau, Tanya Dixie, Henry Clarkson, Rob Park, RL, David Bezer, and Colin Castleman. If you want to know more about French volunteers that served for the Germans during World War II, you can click right here. Please consider becoming a patron, because with your donations I can keep doing this and expand. Thank you so much for watching. Das Vidania.